Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Battlefield, Pennsylvania. Today we're on location in Warminster, Bucks County. In 1777, the British Army occupied Philadelphia. For the next several weeks, they tangled with Washington's Continental Army all throughout the region. One of those places was here at Crooked Billet. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Joining me today to discuss the Battle of Crooked Billet is historian Denis Cook and historian Andrew Zellers-Frederick. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Denis, start us off. Tell us about your background.
Well, my background, I'm an attorney, and I've also been a lifelong resident of Warminster Township, Pennsylvania. I do fraud investigations for a living, and in my spare time, I love doing research of history. Back when I was a kid in high school, I got interested in the Battle of Crooked Billet, and I started collecting everything I could about the battle. And seriously, around 1996, 1997, I started to do historical document research and with the goal of reconstructing John Lacey's entire campaign.
Andrew?
Well, I've been in the historical business for over 3 decades. I actually began my career with the National Park Service. I was fortunate enough to be a ranger/historian at parks like where Independence Hall was located, Yorktown Battlefield, and the Edgar Allan Poe House. I've run other historic sites as executive director, Historic Rittenhouse Town, which is a National Historic Landmark, the site of the first paper mill in America. That's down in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. I've run the Masonic Library Museum of Pennsylvania. I was also at Colonial Williamsburg for a number of years, working with their Jamestown project. I was the director of fundraising. I'm a lifelong historian like Denis. I began when I was probably about 8 years old, and my parents took us out to Washington's Crossing or to Valley Forge or places like that. My sister hated it, but I liked it, and it stuck. So when I went through to get my degrees, I got them in history. And I remember my parents saying, well, what are you going to do with this? I said, well, I don't want to teach. I'm going to go into the museum field. So that's what I've been doing. Currently right now, I'm president of the Lehigh Valley American Revolution Roundtable up in Easton, Pennsylvania, where I live now. But I lived in Warminster for 23 years. And this burial ground behind us, when I moved here, it was overgrown, decrepit. All the stones had been damaged, carted away. And so that became a project for me to gradually get it preserved and restored. And it's in much better shape today than it was almost 30 years ago.
Let's talk about the American Revolution leading up to this battle. Sort of big picture. What's been going on in the war?
Well, the British, as you mentioned, have occupied Philadelphia. Their goal was what normal European armies did. You take your opponent's capital and its government, and the war is over. I think that's one thing the British didn't grasp totally was that, the Continental Congress was a very loose organization governed by the Articles of Confederation. Each state was like its own country. So when the British approached Philadelphia after we lost the Battle of Brandywine, the Congress just moved to Lancaster and then to York. So the British sat with Philadelphia and did not alter the course of the war.
And so once the British got into Philadelphia, Washington had a decision to make. And basically they didn't have enough men to fight them out. So they decided to conduct a virtual siege. And so they stationed themselves west of Philadelphia at Valley Forge. At least the Continental Army went there. And then he assigned the Pennsylvania militia north of the city to guard all the roads coming in and out of the city in the north. And then on the east side was the New Jersey militia. And then later on in the south, they put General Smallwood and his Continental Brigades down there.
Washington's always had to make some quick decisions in the war. Can you compare the two armies for us, Washington's Continental Army and Howe's British Army? Because they were not very similar at all, were they?
No, I mean, the British Army was entirely professional, manned with professional soldiers. I believe the average training was almost 8 to 9 years. Washington's Army, on the other hand, they have been in existence, at least the Continental Army, since 1775. So it's really citizen soldiers that are fighting at this time. So he has a job of training a professional army while also conducting a war.
And this goes on at Valley Forge. Everyone probably has heard the name von Steuben, the drill master. He molded the Army into being more professional and being able to take the British on almost one-to-one on some occasions. That was proven at Monmouth, which the battle was, most history looks at it as a draw. But still, the Continental Army had evolved quite a bit. Up here, where we are today, as Denis was saying, this is militia, sort of like the National Guard of its day, called up for 2 months from different counties in Pennsylvania. Not a lot of training, not well armed at all, but they're taking on the professional British soldiers.
You mentioned not well armed. Could we talk about Washington's supplies or maybe lack thereof throughout the war?
Particularly around the time, the Valley Forge period, there was an entire breakdown by February of '78 of the procurement system. And so he had, there's a famous letter he wrote, "This army shall starve, dissolve, or disperse," because not only couldn't they get food to the camp, they also couldn't get clothing and other supplies to really train the army. Lacey had the additional problem of trying to protect his armaments while he was waiting for his reinforcements to come. He had showed up at his camp. There were 3,000 stands of arms laying all around the camp, and he only had 60 to 100 men at Graham Park at the time. And so we had to gather them all up, and they had to put them in a place of safety. So he had established an armory, a forward armory in Doylestown, which was about 10 to 15 miles up north. And then the actual armory for the militia was up in Allentown. So it was quite a distance, but you couldn't go hauling around all of Bucks and Montgomery County with all these armaments with nobody there to have them. So you had to wait for the reinforcements to show up. And they were coming from Cumberland County and York County.
We mentioned Lacey. We'll talk about him in a bit. But we said something very interesting. Washington basically had to form an army. So where does he get, for example, officers? How does he separate a citizen volunteer from a commander without really a lot of formal training?
Well, in the beginning, they wanted to really model the Army on European standards. Now, fighting in America is very different, but Benjamin Franklin and other diplomats, Silas Deane, are in France, and a lot of these unemployed officers, because there's no war going on in Europe, come to them, present their credentials. Some of them were very exaggerated, and they were promised high commands here in America. It got to the point where Washington became very annoyed at that, because he did have qualified men that had served for years in militia capacities, and maybe they weren't up to British standards, but they understood what needed to be done. So you would have a clash between these Europeans coming over and the Native American people that are born here. Now, fortunately, from that stock that came over, we got a lot of great officers. The Marquis de Lafayette, I mentioned von Steuben, Louis Duportail. They were able to weed out the bad ones.
But that question, it really is a good point to make a distinction between the Continental Army and Washington appointing his officers. And on this side is the militia, which is not about Washington, it's more about the Pennsylvania state government and President Wharton. Lacey gets his appointment from the Pennsylvania Supreme Executive Council, and he came up through the ranks. He was in the Continental Army at one time. He was in the first year of the war, but he only served a one-year term and resigned from the Army at that point. He then became very active in the militia and got elected a lieutenant colonel. by his men. And then in January of '78, the Pennsylvania government needed another brigadier general because Major General John Armstrong, who you're familiar with from the Kittanning expedition, had to go home on a leave of absence, as well as General James Potter, because he had a sick wife at home. So the appointment as an officer, a brigadier general, comes from the Pennsylvania state government. So in effect, Washington is not selecting Lacey, it's the Pennsylvania government that's doing it.
And we should mention how young Lacey is.
Yes.
He's only about, what, 23?
23, 25 if you depend on whose birthday you believe, but we didn't know how old Alexander Hamilton was by his birthday, so it's okay for a man like John Lacey. We don't know his birthday either. On his gravestone and in his memoirs, he says it's February 4th, 1755, so he's about 23 years old.
When William Howe captures Philadelphia, a lot of people may be surprised to find out that he wasn't entirely hated in the city. It was somewhat of a comfortable situation for him. Could you talk about the British occupation of Philadelphia from the citizen viewpoint?
Well, Philadelphia was the major city in North America, British North America, about 25,000 inhabitants. A lot of merchants, people that belonged to the Society of Friends or Quakers, a lot of people that were loyal to the crown. And what's more, the Continental Congress had issued paper money. You know, they were called not worth a continental. The paper became almost worthless. And so when the British came in, they brought coin, gold, silver, reestablished paying for things and acquiring them. And people were quite pleased to see the British Army in the city. In fact, they thought, this is it. It's going to collapse. You know, we need to be on good terms with the British. Howe was certainly very sympathetic. He and his brother, Admiral Howe, were both Whigs and wanted to see peace with America. Their history with America went way back to their brother, who was killed in the French and Indian War. And so the Howes were well thought of, and they made attempts at peace overtures to try and end the war and the killing.
Yeah, you have to remember the occupation lasted 9 months, and at this point the population is divided as to what their loyalties are. So you have a faction that is pro-King George, you have a faction that's pro-independence, and then you have a middle faction which is neutral. So by the time Howe occupies Philadelphia, most of the independents have left the city, and a lot of it is occupied by the loyalists and the neutral. Usually they call it the Quakers, the Society of Friends, who were pacifists and didn't want to engage in the war. So as Howe enters the city, you'll read in the citizen's diary of the time, like Elizabeth Drinkers, Sarah Logan Fisher, Robert Morton. Over time, the welcome gets worn out. They're initially kind of happy that the British are there. Over time, though, when they start to realize that you have 20,000 men showing up overnight, along with women and children, and there's not enough food around. There's not a Giant or a Sheetz or anything to go to. They have to go around the countryside and forage for their food and supplies, and it becomes very, very hard, especially fuel. They need wood, and they start taking down the fences. The Hessians start going into some of the crops that the citizens have grown and start taking them and say, well, there's enough for you. We need stuff. We're hungry. So I would say over time, they kind of wear out their welcome.
Was one of Howe's goals, I guess what we would call today public relations, initially building up goodwill in the city, getting people back to his side? Because Dennis, what you're describing, he sort of fails at that as time goes on.
I think he made a valiant effort. Of course, he was, to me, I think, a gentleman soldier, but he loved a good time. I mean, he issued a series of orders to say no plundering, no thievery, but it's very, very hard to keep control of everybody. And so I think he's considered a general who didn't really fight as viciously as supposedly a Burgoyne or a Clinton would go at it, because he always felt that we need to bring the population back into the fold.
One of the things that historians will see in the writings leading up to the battle is that farmers from the countryside are going into Philadelphia to sell their wares to the British. Washington thought this was a real problem. Can we talk about that?
Well,
Sure, go ahead.
well, Washington looked at this as that's depriving his men of supplies. The food and whatever forage is going to the garrison. And we all know, Denis mentioned the supply situation out of Valley Forge. It was desperate by February of 1778. So these farmers are going in, they are anticipating being paid in, again, we mentioned British coin, hard coin. And that's where, Lacy comes in. His orders are to stop this by any means, to prevent them getting in. And, he is known to have ordered farmers whipped or their supplies taken from them and, confiscated. And so I guess it becomes a sort of a game to get past him. He doesn't have the manpower to cover every road and every mile between the Schuylkill River and the Delaware. So I guess a system started to get in. Also at this time too, the British are sending out large-scale forage expeditions, and they, are bringing in cattle, they're bringing in cloth, bringing in foodstuffs, and also they're proactive as well.
Yeah, and most people neglect to read the plans that General Armstrong and Washington made for the Valley Forge winter, which Lacy inherited. And there was a promise of 1,000 men. At the time, Washington actually wanted the force that was in the field at the time, which was about 2,500 men under Armstrong and Potter. The Pennsylvania government couldn't really afford that. So along the way, the number was reduced to 1,000. Because the men only served every 2 months, you had to wait for reinforcements all the time, and most of them didn't show up. And so there was times where Lacy's force dwindled down to 60 to 53 men. And it was very, very difficult to try to guard almost what Armstrong called was 9 capital roads. Lacy reduced it down to 5. And they were basically trying to keep the supplies out of the city, which even Washington acknowledged, even with the Continental Army on the west side, it was impossible to be able to affect that. So it was do what you can. And the standing orders for all the generals were, if you couldn't take the supplies away with you, burn them and destroy them, because it's better that the British don't get them, even though their supply situation was desperate.
This is if I'm a farmer in this case, this is a situation that sounds like loyalties may be fluid. One side is trying to burn your crops, one side's trying to steal your crops. Talk about the loyalties of people, and really, was loyalty even an issue at that point if you're a farmer trying to sell your wares?
Yeah, Bucks County at the time, I believe was notoriously loyalist.
Yeah. Right.
And historians usually demonstrated by a number of militia that came out. Bucks County was called out to go to Lacy's camp, and maybe not maybe, but in April, only 21 men showed up. And there were 60,000 men on the rolls of the Pennsylvania militia throughout the state. And so when you consider by April, shortly before the Battle of Crooked Billet, he's only got 300 men reporting for duty. And so the area he's patrolling, he even says in his own memoirs, you would mistake it for the land of my enemies. And so it doesn't really bring anyone over to anyone's side when an American forage party shows up and at the point of the bayonet is demanding food off your table, because they are not being supplied themselves. There's no way to feed them. Colonel Joseph Hart, who was a leader of the militia, actually wrote to Lacy very early on at the beginning of his command and said he witnessed himself some of General Potter's men coming in and stealing food off his table, and asked and demanded that they be protected, or else they'll seek protection elsewhere.
We've mentioned the British in Philadelphia occupying the city. For some background, the British occupied New York City, even after the war, essentially. Was there ever a sense, maybe talking about Washington's strategy, of how he was going to get the British out of that city? Because theoretically, Could they have held Philadelphia like they held New York, indefinitely?
Well, what changed their minds about Philadelphia was the announcement of the French alliance. And with it, French manpower, ships, supplies, and all. And the British realized they couldn't hold the two capital cities. Delaware could be easily blockaded, and they'd be stuck there. So when this event takes place, it's like the last hurrah for the British in the area. And they're going to be gone in, about 6 weeks, out of Pennsylvania and back to New York, where they're going to reassess what they're going to do, make the decision to continue to hold New York. New York was something Washington always wanted because he lost big time in New York, and he wanted to avenge that, repair his reputation. But the decisions made, well, we think there's more loyalists, people to support us, because the British were conducting a war much like Vietnam, where the American Army held the coast, but the interior was all by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Well, it was kind of the same thing going on here. But in the South, they were said, no, the British Army's there, they'll flock by the thousands, the loyalists, and begin their own regiments and support, which did work for a while.
Yeah, and Washington early in the winter did contemplate an attack on Philadelphia, and he was counseled by his generals not to do it because it was too strong a position. Howe had set up a chain of redoubts north of the city that extended from the Delaware to the Schuylkill, and then also they had fortifications along the western side of the city as well, and a bridge that rolled up. And I think the main strategy was, if I can't fight them out, I'll starve them out.
And also the British Army, their commander, was quite content. I mean, there was a social scene, there was theater, there were concerts, at least, for the officers and things. And when Franklin, who's in France trying to negotiate the alliance and everything, is told that, Howe had taken Philadelphia, he retorted that, no, Philadelphia's taken Howe, because Crooked Billet is one of the examples that they came out of the garrison, but most of the time they stayed behind those walls and didn't venture forth. Because the British Army, again, being a traditional European army, didn't campaign during the winter.
We mentioned Crooked Billet, the site we're at now. What was the Crooked Billet?
Well, it was actually a tavern. Back then you either steered yourself by the taverns on the roads or the towns. And Crooked Billet was a tavern. It was knocked down in 1955. It's no longer standing. But it was for lack of better words, it was the center of Lacey's patrol area. And so it was an ideal position for him to set up a camp so that he could move equal distances north, south, east, and west.
We mentioned Lacey's movements, why Washington sent him. Let's talk about the British side. Who would have been the commander in this particular case on the British side?
Well, who brought the plan for attacking Lacey is an excellent soldier who rose really through the ranks, starting as an ensign and ending up being a major. And we're talking about John Graves Simcoe, excellent cavalry officer. If anybody watched the show Turn, he is not a psychopath as they portray him. In fact, very conscientious, I think, and militarily prepared. And he, through his spy network, because his unit, the Queen's Rangers, which is a loyalist unit, is patrolling all around this area. So he was familiar with it, and he had set up a network of spies. And one of his informants came to him and said, look, if you want to get Lacey, he's kind of now at Crooked Billet encamped, and use this information as you will. And so Lacey approached his superiors and said, we think we have an opportunity here. Because though Lacey was accomplishing things like holding up farmers and all, it really was just a pinprick, an annoyance. But this was, Howe's going out, let's go out with a bang. And so Simcoe presents his plan. the plan is accepted. Overall command will be Lieutenant Colonel Robert Abercrombie, who's a veteran of the French and Indian War. And so this unit's put together. And the British learned, I think, their lesson from like Lexington and Concord, where it was a slow-moving column. It got picked off. They started out with music playing and everything else and didn't keep to their schedule. Well, this has a tight schedule, and it's a very mobile unit. Light infantry, mounted troops, the cavalry, dragoons, with a plan on how they're going to surround Lacey at Crooked Billet.
You mentioned something that we haven't talked about in 4 seasons of this show, which I think is interesting, and that's intelligence gathering and spying. Could you guys talk about that? Because that sounds like it's pretty important in this case.
Yeah, Lacey actually would at times, and Washington as well, would actually pay people to go into the city to get information. So there's often a network of going on, and Washington also has patrols of dragoons, and Major John Clark, who was the head of his spy network at then, was also patrolling in the same area Lacey was. So there is a need for information when troop movements occur. And in this case, Major John Simcoe had gotten through one of the farmers who had come from the district, the northern district, had come down and said, gave him information about this changeover of men up at the billet. Lacey had dwindled down to 50 to 53 men, and he was waiting reinforcements close to about 300, and they were looking as an easy score to kind of bag about 300 to 500 militiamen without little harm to themselves. So it became very, very important as to when to strike.
Was it dangerous to be a spy, as we say?
Of course,
Oh, yes.
remember Nathan Hale captured. And on the other hand, John Andre, connected with Benedict Arnold. I mean, it was a hanging offense. So yes, it was dangerous.
Yeah, in March of, around March the 15th, Washington had ordered 150 of Lacey's men to report to Bartholomew's Tavern up in Montgomery County to witness the hanging of a man named Worrell. So it was a dangerous time.
Could we talk about the movement of troops out of Philadelphia to Lacey's position?
Well, you know, Simcoe puts together this plan, which is approved by his superiors. They have about, give or take, 850 men, which is a sizable number of troops to bring out of the city. They have the Queen's Rangers, Simcoe's, his command. They have elements of the 17th Dragoons. They have Abercrombie's regiment, making up sort of the ground forces that were a little bit slower, but they pushed them. And then several Loyalist Dragoon units from Philadelphia and Chester County. So again, mobility was key. And they left very early in the morning through that chain of redoubts and had a separation point, which I don't know if we've ever agreed where.
Yeah,
exactly
they have
it
a
is.
disagreement as to whether they traveled together or separated at one point or completely came up different routes. If you read Simcoe's journal, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Abercrombie came up separately from the Rising Sun up to the York Road, and which basically was the main route between Philadelphia and New York City. And Crooked Billet was in the middle of that, along the way, let's put it that way. And then Simcoe took a more eastern route, up one of the other major thoroughfares up, it was called the Oxford Road and 2nd Street Pike at the time. And it was really coming in from the east, and Robert Abercrombie would come in from the west.
And of course, the overall goal is to bag Lacey's unit, to completely surround it in a pincer movement. And it's surprising that this number of troops can get out of the city almost to their target and not be discovered or have Lacey warned. It wasn't until the very last stages that some kind of warning goes out. I mean, they had to go through population areas, there were people's farms and all, and they were spied, but You mentioned before about where people's loyalties were. Well, some of them just didn't want to get involved. You know, better to stay out of it. Lacy did send out patrols, and one patrol did see the British troops, but their orders were to fire a volley. Never did it. And so they end up sending a runner, which I believe got there almost at the time of the battle.
Yeah, there was
starts.
one runner that never showed up, and then Lieutenant Nielsen, who was in command of that scouting party, sent a second runner who made it back to camp. By the time they made it back to camp, the British Dragoons were already along York Road and hiding behind the fences and the trees. So it was a little too late.
They are getting ready to snap the trap, and they get off schedule. And they try several ways to kind of intimidate Lacy's command. British Dragoons go riding through Crooked Billet. They are able to they arouse the camp. You know, Lacy does react and tries to rally his men. Lacy also has a baggage train, you know, wagons and things, and he's trying to get away with that because it's valuable supplies.
Yeah, Lacy reports he was in a house across the street, the house of John Gilbert, and he and his aide-de-camp William Means were one traditional story is Mrs. Gilbert roused them from their beds and they ran across the road and hurriedly organized all the men into a column. And he quickly assessed the situation and realized he was getting surrounded on three sides, but he noticed that the fields north were still open and the roads were still open that way. And one point we want to make is that Simcoe had hoped that they would run toward the protection of Washington at Valley Forge. But Lacy never really depended on Washington. He was a Bucks County man, and so he fled north. And so he made it, organized his men, and he reports some warm fires between his flanking parties and the soldiers on the road and the cavalry soldiers coming in from the east. And they go through a wood and they basically exchange some warm fires with the dragoons who were blocking his way. And they make way as the larger column comes by, and they flee north into the fields.
And something Denis mentioned was that Lacy was a Bucks County man, born and raised here. I guess it was something the British either forgot or didn't think it was important, that he knew this country like the back of his hand, and you know, knew routes to get out and get away from the British, and did not go the route that they anticipated, going towards Washington, but going, you know, almost in the opposite direction. But nevertheless, the baggage train, because it's slower, it gets captured, and most of its men either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner.
Yeah. So Lacy reports 26 killed, and eight wounded, and 9 were supposedly burned in the buckwheat straw. And he reports even some of his soldiers being hacked and stabbed with cutlasses. And this gets around to the countryside and in the Pennsylvania newspapers, and there's a bit of an outrage about it.
It's a good PR war because it becomes, you know, a massacre.
Yeah.
You know, that they are cut down and things like that. Well, if you study the Revolution and you look at things, you'll see that when the British had a victory, like also at Paoli, where the Americans were caught off guard, almost the same thing. They were unprepared. The British go in with their muskets unloaded and just the bayonet. Well, that's a massacre. And war being what it was, you got to remember there's a lot of smoke from firing, a lot of confusion. It's not like you can put up your hands and, okay, take me prisoner. Better to be sure, and by being sure, making your opponent is dead. But it's funny that when the British make an overwhelming victory like this, using their bayonet, using their training, it's a massacre. That has to be why we lost. But when the Americans turn around and do the same thing, there's a classic engagement down in the Carolinas under a British or a loyalist officer named Pyle. And his men are riding one way and they see this unit coming down, and they assume they're British by their uniform. But they were Light Horse Harry Lee, his men. And he notices it and orders his men to wait till the columns are right next to one another. And then a signal is given, and they hack the British to bits. I think 86 men killed.
We mentioned PR a lot in this case. The British are in Philadelphia. That's been stagnant for a while. In a lot of ways, the revolution is a war of ideas as much as anything. That term massacre is so important. When you mentioned Paoli, but even early in the war, the Boston Massacre, one of the great weapons the Patriot side has. Because before that, and this is part of my research, massacres almost exclusively things that Indians do to white settlements. And there's such an emotional response to that massacre, that term. And we see it used so much in the revolution. Now, we talked about the people fighting here. A lot of them were Americans fighting Americans.
This is America's first Civil War, well ahead of what goes on in the 1860s. You had families split down the middle. You had brother against brother, relatives. It also served, on some occasions, as a way to get even with people. Let's say your neighbors had been unkind to you, or a deal gone bad with land or something, and they were patriots. Well, you joined the British. So in the name of the crown, you got even with them. And the same thing with the American troops.
Why do you think we, as a society, not obviously historians, but as a society, why do you think we stray away from or ignore that partisan nature of it? Why do we like to make it us versus them?
Well, I think that this is the American Revolution, the birth of our country. We don't want to bring up so much that there were Americans that were totally against it. John Adams gives a figure, a very general one, and Denis alluded to it, that maybe 1/3 or a little bit more were patriots, 1/3 remained loyal to the crown, and a lot of them left after the revolution and went to Canada or other British colonies. And you got 1/3 that's kind of sitting on the fence saying, well, we'll just watch and see who wins, and then we'll play up to them.
I think that question has a whole nother show in it because, academics right now are studying the whole, Pennsylvania itself was in a revolution itself. There was arguments over the new Constitution, and Lacey represented a new breed, right? He wasn't, he was a farmer and he was a mill owner. He wasn't an aristocrat. He wasn't a big landowner. And now the state of Pennsylvania sees that more and more of the middling sort and the lower sort want to be involved in decision-making in the government. And so it's, I don't think we ever really want to think of, we pursued our liberty by using methods of oppression. In other words, forcing men into the militia and forcing farmers to give food to us. And also, we don't want to hear about an American soldier actually putting a rope around the neck of a market man or whipping them or dragging them with a horse. It's always the British that had the bad behavior. We're never going to really know who was responsible for the bad behavior at Crooked Billet. When you read the letters of the time, and shortly before the encampment, there's engagements in which the British regulars in the 16th, 17th Dragoons had done bad behavior and had stabbed and wounded and burned farmsteads. But it's also Queen's Rangers. Earlier in March, they had had 2 engagements over in New Jersey at Hancock's house and Quinton's Bridge, and there had actually been some killings there and stabbings there. So it's very, very difficult to tell. But normally, like we tend to read this one-sided, like all the British things, all they did was bad things, and the Americans didn't do any bad things. There were some, it was like sometimes it was liberty, but you had to impose oppressive measures on people in order to get them to comply.
We mentioned Crooked Billet as a last hurrah, in a way, for the British in Philadelphia. What happens to the British after this battle? How do they leave?
Well, we said in the next month and a half, they pack up lock, stock, and barrel. Some of the command goes by sea. They're going back to New York, and probably the majority is going across New Jersey to New York. And you mentioned before about intelligence. Washington gets this all at his camp. He's going to try out this army that has been trained by von Steuben and take the British on. Fortunately, when the battle occurs, it's the height of summer, much hotter than it is today, and there were more casualties from sunstroke and heat and things like that than there were from actual fighting. But it just showed that the Army now could stand up. There was one incident, though, where Washington's second in command, who's a Lee, General Lee, who's not related to the Lees of Virginia, sort of panics and instead of attacking, begins to withdraw. And they said it's one of the few times in the war you saw Washington lose his temper and swear up a storm and relieve Lee of his command and re-energize the attack. But the British make it back to New York in relative safety and plan their next strategy, which is going to the south.
A lot of people, after Crooked Billet, Lacey basically, as of the day of the battle, actually comes back to the billet and resumes what he was doing the whole time. A lot of people don't understand that his force was never meant to engage a large force like 850 men. They were only supposed to be able to deal with small foraging parties. His job was to patrol the roads. So he went back to what he normally did. Potter came back from his leave of absence and only stayed a few days and went back home because, again, the force had dwindled down to about 30 men. Lacey, even though he had been relieved of duty, came back and helped Colonel Frederick Watts with the patrol. He was part of a scouting party that went over to harass the British as they left Philadelphia around June the 23rd.
So we mentioned Lacey, strong Pennsylvania ties. The war goes on. What does he do for the remainder of the time?
Well, the remainder of the time, the day of the battle, he actually comes back and resumes what he was doing all along through the whole winter time. And he was on a temporary assignment. He was awaiting General Potter to return. General Potter returns May the 13th. Washington relieves him of duty. And a lot of historians have taken this to mean like, oh, he was relieved of duty because he messed up at Crooked Billet. And that's not the case at all. There was never an expectation he was ever able to stop all the farm produce going into the city. It turns out that trouble is still at home for Potter, and so he turns around after a few days and goes home. And Lacey comes back to the field, and he resumes the patrols until the British leave the city. At this time, his force dwindles down to about 30 men. He's only there as a volunteer and as a consultant to Colonel Frederick Watts from Cumberland County. And there's a story where a Major Cameron with 10 men in their patrol captured 25 prisoners. And so history doesn't really record or tell about that they were an effective thorn in the side. Maybe not as wide in scope as people would wish they were, but the militia just didn't work that way. And so what he does is he remains a brigadier general. He actually becomes a member of the Supreme Executive Council. He's elected in 1781. He also relocates to New Jersey and marries Antis Reynolds, and he starts an iron mill there. He actually becomes a member of the Assembly of New Jersey, and ultimately they name a township after him, Lacey Township, New Jersey, in Ocean County. And so that's sort of his legacy there.
If we wanted to come visit some of the sites associated with the battle or even follow the path that both sides took, where are some of the places we could go?
Well, there are a number of properties, buildings, that are almost all in private hands that were here at the time of the battle. Just up the road at street in Newtown is Craven Hall. Not all of Craven Hall was here during the battle, but part of it was, and allegedly it was used for the wounded. There are a number of buildings in Hatboro, that date to the time of the battle, so the British would have passed them and things. This cemetery that's right behind us was the Craven Van Zandt burial ground. And though there are no, as far as we understand, anyone killed during the battle, we know that a number of, if not all of these people that are interred here fought in the militia and eventually were buried here. It's interesting that when I moved up here in 1989 and got involved in history and everything going on in the township, they told me about this burial ground. And I remember going out one night with my dog and trying to find it. Could not locate it. And went out a number of times. Finally, I looked and there was just this great overgrowth here. So we ventured in very carefully and saw the broken off grave markers. Apparently over a period of time, the cemetery had been desecrated. People hauled off the grave markers for Halloween decorations and what have you. And so I've sort of made this a mission to get this restored, get it cleaned up. We got the VA to give us new headstones, same kind you'll find in Arlington. Trouble is we didn't know exactly where they were, but we got one because we had a postcard that showed the image of the cemetery about 1900, and had a ceremony to rededicate it and such. But actually all this ground that's in front of us belongs to the Craven Hall Historical Society, and we got the school district of here to give us the land to preserve it. So that's what you're seeing today. And there are other burial grounds around the area up in Hartsville that have veterans in them, and the churches and things like that.
Yeah, we should mention too that in 1861 there was a monument dedicated in Hatboro by the historian William Watts Harts Davis, and William Buck, I should mention him. That was moved to the grounds of the Crooked Billet Elementary School, which is currently undergoing renovation, and they also have taken the monument and they're reconditioning it now. In Warminster, along the road, is a monument that was placed in 1928 that commemorates the soldiers that were buried in the burned in the buckwheat straw. And then there's also a dedication when William Watts Hart Davis in the Civil War was training Civil War soldiers. The grounds of CB West High School was called Camp Lacey. So that was in memory of him as well.
What should we say is the takeaway from this battle? What do you think is its lasting place in history?
I think anyone who reads about actually Lacey's papers, Lacey's memoirs, and about the battle, particularly members of the armed forces, find a kindred spirit. He embodies the dedication to duty of the military. He was given an assignment, and it didn't matter whether he had 10 men or 600 men, he did it anyway. And I think that's, to me, is probably the most inspiring thing about it. And it's a shame, around 1940 there was an article written that tried to smear his reputation as a bad general. And the reason why I even got involved in studying this was because I just thought that was such an odd observation to make, because 3 weeks later there was an incident at a place called Barron Hill where another young general in his 20s was surrounded on 3 sides, and history has recorded him as being brilliant, and his name was Marquis de Lafayette.
And on the other side of the take, John Graves Simcoe kept a detailed journal of the war, and he's in his 20s as well. Mm-hmm. These are mostly
like 25.
Yeah, mostly young men, and Simcoe is involved in the war to the very end, and then he goes to Canada and he becomes Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. And while he's there, he brings in British law, government, and also bans slavery. I turned up a little fact that apparently before he took the Queen's Rangers, Simcoe wanted to form an African-American unit of loyalists. So progressive for his side of the coin.
Are there any annual events coming up that you might talk about that people might want to come see?
Well, Crooked Billet Day, which is done by the Crooked Billet Elementary, they commemorate the battle. They usually have some current servicemen there, dignitaries, and put a wreath on the monument that's now being restored. So that probably won't happen again for a couple of years till the school is rebuilt and the monument put back into place. Every so often, if it's a big anniversary, we've sort of reenacted Crooked Billet a number of times, done the battle itself, but that's not a firm and item.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm involved in a lot of activities at Washington Crossing Park, so I think they would knock me over the head if I didn't mention that we do have Market and Muster Day to commemorate the mustering in the militia every year, and we do that around September. You can check the website for the dates. And then also we do the annual crossing in the Delaware, Washington Crossing the Delaware, the commemoration of that. That's on Christmas Day, but a lot of people don't know that the second Sunday in December is a full dress rehearsal. So if you can't make it on Christmas, you can make it on the second Sunday in December.
And it's less crowded.
Yes.
On that note, I'd like to thank my guests for joining us today. Remember to pick up a copy of our new book, written by yours truly, Battlefield, Pennsylvania, available now. For everyone here at Battlefield, Pennsylvania, I'm Brady Kreitzer saying so long.